All apps have settings. These settings tell the app how to connect to backend databases, where to send the logs, and they also contain secrets or access keys that you don't want the bad guys to get a hold of. Often these settings are stored in a single configuration file, and many times these config files are written in the JSON format. For me, most of my web apps have a config file in the JSON format, but lately I've been using YAML as an alternative, and I've come to enjoy some of the benefits that YAML config files provide. Today we'll talk about the differences between JSON and YAML for configuration files, and hopefully by the end I'll make you a believer of using YAML over JSON. Let's dive in. What is a config file? It's just a single file that has settings for your application, allowing you to make tweaks from one place instead of having to dig into the actual source code itself. Here's an example of a config file for a web app written in the JSON spec. And you can see a few things like the name of the app, the version, if we should have debugging or not. We also see some network settings like the host and the port that the web app will run on. Below that, we see database information, which can be used by the app to make a connection string and connect to a backend database. It has some important things like a username and password. At the end, we see some logging settings. Here it looks like we want to log at the info level, and we can also see where we want these logs to be sent. This is a fairly standard way of configuring your web app using JSON, and there's nothing wrong with it. But today, we're going to look at another option, the YAML option. And it looks the same for the most part. It has the same content, but there are some subtle differences that make long-term maintenance much more pleasant. Let me give you some reasons I prefer YAML over JSON for my config files. First of all, YAML just has a cleaner format. Let's look again at that JSON config file, and we'll focus on one part where we define the network settings. Here we see the server settings in JSON format. The same code in YAML format hopefully makes you feel a little less stressed. Let's look at them side by side. Both JSON and YAML have this concept of key value pairs. Keys are what occur to the left of the colon, and they name the things that you want to track. Values occur to the right of the colon. They can be strings, numbers, lists, or even another collection of key value pairs. In JSON, the structure of the config file is given by these curly braces and these commas to indicate what hierarchy is occurring. In YAML though, you'll notice that there's no braces and there's no commas. Instead, the structure is given by whitespace or indentation. You'll also notice that in JSON we need quotes around the keys and any strings that occur, but in YAML, that's not the case. You can see YAML doesn't need these extra characters, no braces, no commas, no quotes, which makes reading the YAML configuration much easier. But more importantly, when you're making changes to your config file in YAML, you don't have to worry about forgetting a comma or making sure that every open brace has a matching close brace, which makes long-term maintenance much more simple. It might not matter much for this simple example, but if you have a long config file with many different settings or many quotes, braces, and commas, it's quite easy to forget something. And the YAML equivalent makes management much faster. Here's another reason I like YAML: comments. First, let's talk about how we can use comments in our JSON config file. I'm just kidding. You can't use comments in JSON config files. That's by design. JSON is primarily designed for communication between machines, and machines don't read comments, they ignore them outright. Comments are for us humans who don't know what we're doing. So if you have a JSON config file that looks like this, you need to know what each of these key value pairs means and what you can safely change them to. Or you need to have some kind of external documentation that tells you that. The same config file in YAML looks like this, but you can add comments. For example, here we have a key value pair that tells us the environment is currently set to dev, and there's a helpful comment right after that that tells us this environment can also be set to staging when we want to test our app, or production when we're ready to deploy. Similarly, we can add helpful messages and comments. Here we have a warning that says that this debug setting must be set to false before we deploy to production. These two examples show that you can have comments at the end of a line, but you can also have comments on an entire line, which lets you take in a YAML file and break it up into different sections with as many comments as you want. Do you like repeating yourself? I sure don't, but in JSON, you have to repeat yourself. Here's another config file. In this case, we have a couple of services. We have an API service with a few settings and a worker service, kind of like a series of VMs that does the heavy lifting with their own settings. You'll notice that both the API and the worker have log settings, and the log settings are exactly the same. They're identical. This is an example of repeating yourself, which is not a good programming best practice. Here's the same config file in YAML. We still have two services, API and worker, and both services have identical logging configurations. What's different in YAML though is you can reuse nodes or parts of your YAML config file somewhere else. Let me show you how to do that. We're tweaking the YAML config a little bit. Here, the first time we have our logging node, we see a little bit of extra information. This ampersand effectively tells the YAML parser to store the settings in this key value pair in something like a variable called default logging. This in the world of YAML is called anchoring. It effectively takes all the values at this point and stores it in a variable called default logging. Later on, we can see that when we want to use this logging again, we are referencing it by its alias default logging with the star operator. And what this tells the parser is that when we get to this logging key, we want to import everything that we have in default logging. Effectively then, as humans, we see this in our YAML config file. We don't have any repetition. But then when the YAML parser comes and interprets this, the machine or the app code will see something that looks like this. So we get the best of both worlds. Here's another example of how this anchoring and aliasing in YAML might be helpful. A new config file is here. We have some information about databases. We have a primary database and then some replica databases to handle high traffic to our web app. You'll notice that both of these databases have nearly identical settings. The engine host, port, username, and password are exactly the same. It's only the name of the databases and whether the database has a read-only attribute that differs. So in this situation where you have almost identical settings, but a few things that are different, you can use this concept of node merging. Let's see how that happens. In this case, we have a slightly different YAML configuration. We're defining our common attributes in this key called default database. So we have engine host, port, username, and password appearing again, and it's being anchored as a variable called default DB. Later on, when we actually define our databases, the primary and replica database are referencing the alias default DB, and they're using this double bitwise operator to effectively inject whatever we defined up here into this line here. And then after that, we just define the unique attributes like the name and the read-only attribute for the primary and replica databases. As humans, we see this. We're not repeating the username and password over and over again. And then when the YAML parser comes and passes this config file to the web app, the machine will see this, where the username and password and the other settings are exactly where they need to be for the two different databases. This is great because it prevents future bugs that come about from changing your config file. You don't have to worry about making a change in one location and forgetting to make the same change in another location. With anchoring and aliasing, you make the change in one place and you can trust it propagates to wherever that change needs to be made. These are a few reasons I like YAML over JSON for my config files. YAML is growing in popularity. You'll find it quite a bit in the wild on many different platforms today. For Docker Compose files, YAML is used to set up your container configuration. It's also used in GitHub Actions workflows for your CI/CD pipelines. It's used in dbt model configuration. It's used in Kubernetes configuration. And who knows, it might even appear in your next project. Let's look at some of these examples in the real world. Here's an example of Docker Compose. It's a YAML file with many comments at the top, and this particular file sets up Airflow on a local computer. You'll see that the first key is being anchored as Airflow common, and here's where YAML is being used to define what image to pull from, certain environment variables, and what volumes are needed for these containers. Later on, you can see that the variable or the anchor alias common is being used in many places. Here we see that Airflow common is being merged into the settings for the web server container. It's also being used for the scheduler and the worker. And then within each container, you can see the additional settings that are specific to that container. Here's an example of GitHub Actions workflow. This is a template that effectively runs a pipeline whenever there is a push or pull request made on the default branch. Scrolling down to the steps, you can see each of the steps that it runs. It looks like in this case, we're setting up Python 3.10, installing some dependencies, and then eventually running our tests to make sure that whatever change we made to the branch did not break any tests. Another example is our DBT model configuration. Here's an example I had a couple of years ago. And in this YAML file, we can see how our various stages or schemas are being used. In this case, we want our stage schema to materialize as a view, and then our actual final schema to be materialized as an actual table. These are some examples of where YAML appears. Now, to be clear, JSON is still great. It's been around for a long time, it's an industry standard, and it's not going anywhere. But for config files, YAML has a few advantages, and I hope that you see those advantages now. It has a cleaner format, which makes reading and editing your config files much faster. It allows for comments, which makes your YAML config files self-documenting. And it allows you to reuse code, which means you're not repeating yourself and you're not risking an accidental change in one place, but not all the places that you needed to make that change. I plan on using YAML for more of my projects, and I hope I've encouraged you to do the same. If you have any questions, please reach out to me in the comments below. If you liked what you see, like and subscribe. And until next time, happy coding.